Hello, everyone, and welcome back. There are certain moments in life when everything appears normal on the surface, yet something deep inside begins to shift. The goals that once motivated you lose their meaning. The path that once felt certain starts to feel unfamiliar. And without warning, you find yourself standing at a crossroads you never expected to reach. Have you ever felt like everything in your life collapsed at the same time, so completely that you no longer knew where to begin again? Not the kind of loud failure that everyone can see, but a quiet unraveling that happens beneath the surface. The things that once gave you a clear sense of identity suddenly begin to feel distant and unfamiliar. Work no longer feels meaningful. Relationships no longer provide the same sense of stability. Even the image you once carried of yourself begins to crack and lose its certainty. From a psychological perspective, when everything falls apart, what is happening is not necessarily a problem that needs to be fixed immediately. It may be a process that needs to be understood. There are seasons in life when the version of yourself that once guided you can no longer carry you forward. The structures that once felt safe begin to dissolve, creating space for something deeper and more authentic to emerge. Most suffering during these periods comes from trying to hold on to what no longer belongs to the present chapter of life. We try to return to the old identity, the old role, the old sense of security. Yet that attachment often prolongs the struggle. This collapse is not necessarily here to destroy you. It may be here to bring an old chapter to its natural conclusion. In this video, you'll discover why feelings of emptiness, confusion, and loss of direction are not always signs of failure. Sometimes they are signs that a profound transformation is already underway. If you're currently living through that stage, stay with me until the end, because what feels like an ending today may actually be the beginning of an entirely different life. There are periods in life when you do not need a dramatic event to feel as though everything is falling apart. No major tragedy, no obvious loss, no single moment you can point to and explain. Life on the outside continues as usual. You go to work, you fulfill responsibilities, you appear stable in the eyes of others. Yet internally, something has changed. A quiet feeling emerges that is difficult to describe. Something that once gave your life a sense of direction is no longer there. The most unsettling part of this experience is not intense suffering. It is the gradual loss of meaning. You cannot always identify exactly what has disappeared. You only know that the things that once made you feel connected to life no longer reach you in the same way. Days begin to pass on autopilot. You are not completely miserable, but you are no longer fully alive either. And that space between surviving and truly living is where many people become exhausted without understanding why. From the outside, a person's life may still appear successful and secure. The career remains, the routine remains, the achievements remain, but eventually a realization appears. You continue showing up every day, yet you no longer feel connected to the life you are living. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for this awareness to emerge. Sometimes it arrives quietly, revealing that the structures supporting your identity have become empty. The foundation is still standing, but it no longer has the strength to carry who you have become. From a psychological perspective, this is not weakness, laziness, or a lack of motivation. A person can only maintain genuine stability when their external life remains connected to their inner reality. When that gap becomes too large, the mind begins trying to correct itself by dismantling what no longer fits. And that process rarely feels comfortable. What has been ignored, suppressed, or avoided for years slowly rises to the surface. Not always as clear answers, but as confusion, restlessness, emptiness, and a growing sense that something important can no longer be ignored. At first, it often arrives through simple questions. Why am I still walking this path? Why does my daily life feel disconnected from who I truly am? Did I choose this life consciously, or did I simply adapt to expectations and survival? These are not meaningless questions. They are often signs that something deeper within is demanding honesty. Imagine your life as a house built many years ago. Its foundation was shaped by circumstances, expectations, social conditioning, and the environments that surrounded you. Over time, you continued building on that foundation. You added achievements, responsibilities, goals, and identities that appeared successful from the outside. The house may still look strong, but if the foundation no longer reflects who you truly are, cracks eventually begin to appear. Not because you failed, but because you have outgrown the structure that once supported you. When those cracks appear, the natural response is panic. We want to repair everything immediately. We search for motivation, productivity, plans, and quick solutions. Yet the deepest crises are rarely solved at the surface, because what is collapsing is not merely a situation, it is a way of understanding yourself, and meaning cannot be restored through temporary fixes. What makes this stage so difficult is its uncertainty. You cannot always explain what has been lost. You only know that something essential no longer feels present. It is like standing on a bridge without being able to see the supports beneath it. Every step feels uncertain, even though the bridge has not completely fallen. Yet this experience is not necessarily proof that you are on the wrong path. Sometimes it is proof that the old path can no longer carry you forward in the same way. A life structure has completed its purpose, and when a structure no longer supports growth, it eventually begins to dissolve. This stage does not demand immediate answers. It does not require dramatic decisions. It asks for something much more difficult: the willingness to acknowledge that the old foundation is ending, without denial, without rushing, without blaming yourself, simply recognizing that what feels like collapse may actually be the closing of a chapter whose purpose has already been fulfilled. And when you finally allow yourself to see that truth, something new begins to open. Not yet a solution, not yet a new beginning, but a space for listening. Because when the old foundation disappears, the most important question is not what you will build next. It is whether you can resist rebuilding the old life simply because the emptiness feels uncomfortable. If you stay with that emptiness long enough, it may reveal something you could never hear before. It may show you the kind of foundation that truly belongs to you. When the old foundation begins to dissolve, what frightens people most is often not the loss itself. It is the feeling that the loss has no meaning. And this is where an important question appears. What if this collapse is trying to tell you something? Psychological crises rarely emerge without purpose. Sometimes they are the final message from parts of yourself that have been ignored for far too long. When subtle signals go unheard, life often finds louder ways to get your attention, not to punish you, but to make sure you stop long enough to listen. Throughout history and literature, many profound transformations begin only after a person reaches a breaking point. Only when old beliefs collapse, familiar identities crumble, and certainty disappears, does a deeper truth finally have the opportunity to emerge. And perhaps that is why the darkest periods of life often become the beginning of the most meaningful journeys. That collapse did not erase who they were. Instead, it marked the beginning of becoming something more genuine, no longer living as an idea of a person, but as a real human being. From a psychological perspective, moments like these are not simply personal failures. They are signals that something deeper within is demanding attention. Much of human suffering comes from living inside an image rather than living from authentic experience. People often spend years trying to maintain a version of themselves that once felt necessary, but no longer reflects who they have become. Eventually, that image begins to crack. And when it does, the collapse carries a message. Something in the inner world is asking for change. Growth rarely happens without discomfort. Whenever awareness expands, old assumptions are challenged, familiar structures weaken, and certainty begins to fade. Pain often appears when life no longer reflects what is true within. It functions like an alarm signal, not to destroy you, but to wake you up. The problem is that many people misunderstand this signal. They assume suffering means they have taken a wrong turn. They rush to recreate the stability they once had. They search for quick solutions, hoping to return to the person they used to be. But if that stability was built upon denying important parts of yourself, returning to it only prolongs the conflict. When collapse arrives, what begins to disappear is not your deepest self. It is the story you have been telling yourself about who you are. Imagine your inner life as a garden. For years, you have cared for the same plants in the same way. At first, everything flourishes. Growth comes naturally. The soil provides what is needed. But eventually, the soil becomes depleted. The plants stop growing despite all your effort. You continue watering them. You continue following the same routine. Yet nothing changes. At some point, adding more fertilizer is no longer enough. The ground itself must be renewed. The old roots must be disturbed. The earth must be turned over. Collapse often feels exactly like that process. It forces you to acknowledge that the foundation beneath your life can no longer support future growth. The true meaning of collapse is not found in the event itself. It is found in what the experience forces you to confront. It reveals forgotten parts of yourself, needs that were ignored, desires that were silenced, truths that were pushed aside in order to be accepted, approved of, or safe. When life is functioning smoothly, it is easy to avoid these realities. But when familiar structures begin to fall away, those hidden parts finally emerge. And suddenly the truth has nowhere left to hide. What matters is understanding that collapse is not a judgment. It is not proof that you are right or wrong. It simply indicates that an inner structure has completed its purpose. If you continue trying to return to that structure solely because the unknown feels frightening, the same crisis often returns in a different form. The invitation hidden inside collapse is simple. Pause. Look deeper. Instead of asking only how to make everything normal again, begin asking how you have truly been living. When you remain with uncertainty long enough, something surprising happens. You begin to realize that not everything that leaves your life is a loss. Some things disappear because they have already fulfilled their purpose. And perhaps one of the most powerful moments in any transformation is the moment you become willing to face your experience honestly. Not with judgment, not with denial, but with openness. Because the instant you stop treating collapse as an enemy, it begins to reveal itself as a guide. And that is where the deeper journey begins. The deeper you move into this process, the clearer it becomes that something within must come to an end. The question is no longer, why is this happening? The question becomes, what part of me can no longer continue? This is where many people hesitate. Because this stage is not about repairing the old life, it is about saying goodbye to it. A quiet departure. One without celebration or certainty, yet one that leaves a very real emptiness behind. Every person develops an identity that helps them navigate the world. It provides stability, it creates a sense of belonging, it helps them survive. But every identity has limits. And when life outgrows those limits, tension begins to build. Many people spend years defining themselves through a single role: the strong one, the responsible one, the achiever, the caretaker, the one who never complains, the one who always endures. For a long time, those identities appear useful, but eventually there comes a moment when the role that once protected you can no longer carry you forward. What hurts most is often not the loss itself. It is realizing that the version of yourself that once worked so well is no longer capable of helping you live fully. At first, this realization feels terrifying. When familiar identities begin to dissolve, it can seem as though you are disappearing. But what is actually fading is not your essence. It is simply an old way of being, an old role, an old image, a structure that has reached its natural limit. The suffering often comes from resisting that process. Part of us always wants to hold on, even when holding on no longer serves us. Think about listening to an old recording of your voice from many years ago. At the time, that voice felt natural. It reflected who you were. Yet hearing it now, you immediately recognize the distance between that version and the person you have become. The voice was not wrong. It simply belonged to another chapter. The departure of the old self feels much the same. Quiet, subtle, yet deeply significant. You gradually realize that you can no longer continue speaking in that voice. You can no longer continue living from that identity. Some challenges in life cannot be solved in the traditional sense. They can only be outgrown. The departure of the old self is one of those challenges. It is not a mistake to fix. It is evidence that growth is demanding space, and growth requires leaving something behind. Many people become impatient during this stage. They want immediate answers. They want a new identity to replace the old one as quickly as possible. But if the old self is not allowed to end completely, the next beginning often becomes a disguised repetition of the past. The same conflicts return. The same patterns emerge. The same struggles continue wearing different clothes. Real transformation requires patience. It requires allowing yourself to enter a space where you no longer know exactly who you are. No labels, no clear definitions, no immediate certainty. Although uncomfortable, this state is not evidence that you are lost. It is evidence that something new is still forming. If you rush through this stage, you carry unfinished confusion into the next chapter. But if you remain present with it, a deeper order gradually begins to emerge. What makes this period difficult is that it touches one of the deepest human fears, the fear of losing control. You no longer know exactly who you are. You no longer have a familiar role to protect. You no longer have an image to hide behind. Yet, within that vulnerability lies a remarkable opportunity. For perhaps the first time, you can encounter parts of yourself that were never created to impress anyone, parts that exist simply to live. The departure of the old self does not require resentment. It does not require rejecting the past. Everything that brought you here served a purpose. It carried you through circumstances you once needed to survive. Its completion does not diminish its value. It simply means its work is finished. And when you finally stop fighting to preserve what is no longer alive, the pain begins to change. It becomes quieter, more orderly, more understandable. Beginning again is not always about taking action. Sometimes it begins with permission. Permission to let an old version of yourself end. Permission to be uncertain. Permission to not know what comes next. Permission to exist without a clear answer. Only then does emptiness stop feeling like an enemy. It becomes a space where something more authentic can finally emerge. Sometimes the way forward is not through pushing harder. Sometimes the way forward begins with letting go. Letting go of the self that helped you survive so that a deeper self can finally learn how to live. After the old self begins to fade, a new question naturally arises. What happens next? When familiar patterns no longer fit, but a new identity has not yet formed, how do you move through the emptiness between them? This is often the stage where people encounter the deepest and most hidden parts of themselves. Not a place of darkness in the sense of evil, but a place filled with everything that was left behind. Unexpressed emotions, ignored desires, unresolved conflicts, intuitions that were dismissed, parts of yourself that seemed inconvenient, unacceptable, or too difficult to face. These hidden elements do not disappear simply because they are ignored. They remain beneath the surface, shaping thoughts, emotions, relationships, and decisions in ways that often go unnoticed. Imagine trying to fit more and more items into an already overfilled suitcase. At first, you manage. You press everything down. You force the zipper closed. From the outside, everything appears fine, but eventually one final push causes the entire suitcase to burst open. Not because you packed incorrectly, but because it had been carrying too much for too long. The inner world works in much the same way. What remains unprocessed does not vanish. It accumulates, and eventually, it demands attention. The deeper regions of the psyche often emerge during periods of collapse, because the old methods of avoidance are no longer working. And although confronting those hidden parts can feel uncomfortable, it is often the beginning of genuine healing. Research today continues to show that emotions do not simply disappear when ignored. Experiences that are never processed consciously can continue influencing stress responses, emotional regulation, behavior, and relationships for years. What is left unfaced does not remain inactive. It continues operating in the background until it is finally acknowledged. The reactions of "why am I like this?" are rarely random. They are often traces of parts of yourself that have been pushed into the background for too long. A crisis is not always the cause of suffering. More often, it is the result of years of silence. Within that darkness lies more than pain. There is also instinct, intuition, and a deeper wisdom that existed long before you learned to hide parts of yourself. It is the part that knows what makes you feel alive and what slowly drains your spirit. When you enter the darker regions of your inner world, you do not encounter only fear. You also encounter honesty, the emotions you buried, the desires you ignored, the truths you sacrificed in order to fit in, feel safe, or gain approval. Darkness is not only a place of loss, it is often the place where awareness expands. No one enters these depths and remains exactly the same. But transformation does not happen because you act on every emotion. It happens because you become willing to acknowledge what you feel. What is ignored gains power. What is acknowledged begins to heal. Many people fear looking inward because they worry they will be overwhelmed by negativity. Yet what is often more dangerous is pretending those hidden parts do not exist at all. Unacknowledged emotions have a way of shaping relationships, decisions, and reactions without our awareness. What is denied within eventually appears somewhere else. This is why facing your inner darkness is not about dwelling on the past or becoming trapped in suffering. It is about staying present with your experience without rushing to judge it. When emotions are allowed into awareness, they begin to change. Not because you force them to change, but because you stop abandoning them. This stage cannot be skipped. You cannot build a new life while remaining divided against yourself. Wholeness does not mean perfection. It means being honest enough to embrace every part of your experience. And only from that place can a meaningful life begin. After moving through that darkness, something unexpected happens. Chaos no longer feels like an enemy. Instead, it begins quietly reshaping you from within. Not through dramatic decisions or sudden breakthroughs, but through small shifts in how you relate to yourself. Real rebirth is not returning to who you were before. It begins when you stop resisting what has already ended. Acceptance is not surrender. It is the moment you stop fighting reality and allow your energy to move forward. At this stage, growth often comes through letting go rather than adding more. Letting go of exhausting roles. Letting go of expectations that no longer fit. Letting go of the pressure to constantly appear strong. As these burdens fall away, something natural begins to return. Your energy, your clarity, your connection with life. Many people notice this change in simple ways. They rest more deeply. They move through life more slowly. They stop forcing themselves to be positive all the time. From the outside, very little may change, but internally, everything feels different. The greatest mistake during this stage is rushing. Trying to rebuild too quickly often recreates the same fragile structure that collapsed before. Real renewal requires patience. It requires permission. Permission to slow down. Permission not to have all the answers. Permission to live without a perfect plan. The more you stop maintaining an outdated image of yourself, the more space becomes available for something authentic to emerge. This process does not feel dramatic. In fact, it often feels surprisingly calm. You may not know exactly where life is heading, but you know you can no longer betray yourself by returning to what no longer fits. That is the beginning of true renewal. It starts with paying attention, noticing what brings lightness, noticing what creates tension, noticing which people, places, and habits help you feel more like yourself. There is no need to force conclusions. Simply listen. That listening becomes the foundation of a new life. As time passes, some goals lose their importance. Some relationships naturally fade. Some identities quietly disappear. This is not always loss. Sometimes it is simplification, a clearing away of what no longer belongs. And from that clearing, a new beginning slowly appears. Not a new person, but a more authentic version of the person who was there all along. A true beginning does not happen when you finally have every answer. It begins when you stop running from yourself, when you stop performing, when you stop trying to become someone else. The deepest transformation is not becoming better. It is becoming more genuine. As inner conflict fades, life begins to feel quieter, not perfect, not easy, but aligned. You start making choices that reflect what you truly feel rather than what others expect. You stop living according to roles that no longer fit. You stop chasing things that leave you empty, and gradually, you develop an inner anchor that does not depend on approval or validation. This new beginning does not promise a life without challenges. It promises something more valuable, a life with less conflict between who you are and how you live. When everything falls apart, the most painful part is often the feeling that you no longer know where you stand. Yet sometimes collapse is not the end. Sometimes it is a turning point, a moment that asks you to stop, listen, and return to yourself. Beginning again is not about going back. It is not about becoming stronger than everyone else. It is about no longer living against your own nature. It is about accepting that not every ending is a failure, and not every emptiness needs to be filled immediately. In the silence that follows collapse, a new order slowly forms, quietly, patiently, truthfully. And perhaps that is what a real beginning looks like, not a dramatic leap forward, but the moment you finally allow yourself to live as you truly are. If this message resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Sometimes simply putting your experience into words is the first step toward understanding it. And if you're interested in exploring more ideas about growth, self-discovery, and the deeper patterns of human behavior, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next conversation. Thank you for listening.